April 5th, 1909. Readers of the Arizona Gazette opened their paper to find a story unlike anything they'd ever seen. It wasn't about politics, war, or the usual frontier gossip. It was about the Grand Canyon, a landmark that was already cloaked in mystery and wonder. The article claimed that deep within its sheer walls, explorers had stumbled upon a hidden cave system filled with treasures that shouldn't exist in America at all. Statues of Egyptian gods, chambers carved into stone, mummies sealed away in eternal rest, even hieroglyphs, inscriptions that spoke of a culture half a world away. And this wasn't rumor, the article said. It was a discovery backed by none other than the Smithsonian Institution. During this time, the United States was still in the middle of its great age of exploration. Railroads had carved their way westward, but many places, including vast stretches of the Grand Canyon, remained unexplored by outsiders. To much of the American public, the canyon was a land of mystery, barely tamed by science and still echoing with myths. Newspapers thrived on this spirit. This was the era of yellow journalism, when sensational headlines sold papers faster than sober reporting ever could. Rival editors pushed their writers to deliver shocking stories, whether they were true, exaggerated, or outright invented. Readers weren't looking for dry reports. They wanted marvels, mysteries, and the impossible made real. At the same time, the Western world had fallen into Egyptomania. Archaeological discoveries in the Nile Valley, most famously the tomb of Tutankhamun, just a little later, captured the global imagination. Egyptian imagery, hieroglyphs, and mummies were exotic, powerful, and irresistible. The thought of Egypt's reach stretching beyond Africa and the Mediterranean tapped into both awe and fear. Awe at their supposed mastery, and fear that our history was incomplete. Into this world of half-explored canyons, sensational newspapers, and Egyptian fever walked one of the strangest claims ever printed in American journalism. According to the Arizona Gazette, the story begins with an explorer named G.E. Kincaid. He was described as a veteran adventurer, traveling down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon on a solo expedition. Somewhere along the way, he spotted what looked like a man-made entrance high up in the canyon walls. So high, the paper said, that he needed ropes and climbing gear to reach it. What he found, the article claimed, was no ordinary cave. The entrance led into a vast tunnel system carved directly into the solid rock. Kincaid realized this wasn't natural. These passages had been chiseled with tools. Their walls straight and even, their angles precise. In his account, he knew immediately that he had stumbled onto something that couldn't be explained by geology alone. The Gazette article then introduces Professor S.A. Jordan, supposedly from the Smithsonian Institution. Kincaid reported his discovery, and the Smithsonian quickly dispatched Jordan and a team of archaeologists to investigate. This wasn't presented as speculation. The Gazette described it as fact, a federally backed professional excavation right in the heart of the Grand Canyon. Once inside, Jordan and his men allegedly uncovered an astonishing underground city. There were vast chambers supported by carefully cut pillars. Hallways stretched on for hundreds of feet, branching into side passages. Storage rooms were filled with grains and seeds, evidence of agricultural planning. Tools and weapons were scattered throughout, crafted in a style unfamiliar to the American Southwest. But the most sensational claims were about the artwork. The walls were covered in hieroglyphic inscriptions, unmistakably Egyptian in appearance. At the center of one chamber stood a massive statue of Isis, the Egyptian goddess of motherhood and magic, carved from stone and placed on a pedestal like an altar. Even more shocking, the team supposedly discovered mummies, dozens of them, some wrapped in cloth, others sealed in alcoves along the rock walls. The Gazette described them as smaller than the average human and preserved with methods that looked strikingly similar to Egyptian embalming. It wasn't just an isolated tomb. According to the article, this was a colony, a settlement that suggested ancient Egyptians had not only visited North America, but had lived here, carving temples and leaving behind their dead in the depths of the Grand Canyon. The Gazette printed the story with absolute confidence. There were no disclaimers, no signs that it was meant as satire. Readers were left to believe that one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history had just been made in their own backyard. And then, silence. The Smithsonian never published reports of such an expedition. There are no academic papers, no recovered artifacts, no photographs. No other major newspapers picked it up. No follow-up articles were printed. It's as if the story fell off the face of the earth. For some, this is the biggest red flag of all, a clear sign that the whole thing was a hoax. But for others, it's the most telling piece of evidence. Because when history-changing discoveries vanish overnight, conspiracy theories begin to grow. And that brings us to the next layer of the mystery, the evidence and the supposed cover-up that keeps this story alive to this day. If the official story ended with a single newspaper article, it might have faded into obscurity. But what gives the mystery of Egypt and the Grand Canyon its staying power are the details, the claims of what was found, who was involved, and what happened afterward. These details, whether true or fabricated, are the evidence. They're the fragments that believers point to as proof and skeptics dismiss as fiction. To understand why this story has endured for over a century, we have to examine each of those claims in turn. At the center of the legend is a single document, the Arizona Gazette's report from April 5, 1909. If this article had been written like a joke or satire, it might have vanished into obscurity. But it wasn't. It carried itself with the tone of a scientific field report, precise, measured, and filled with the kind of detail that makes a story feel real. It spoke of an expedition into the Grand Canyon, led by G.E. Kincaid, who stumbled across a cavern entrance high on the cliffside. What he found inside, the paper claimed, was nothing short of astonishing. A network of tunnels stretching for miles with hundreds of chambers branching into the rock. The descriptions were not vague generalities. The article included dimensions of corridors, notes about the layout, and references to specific objects. The article described storerooms filled with clay jars of seeds and grain, shelves lined with agricultural tools, and copper weapons that bore what it called Oriental design. These were not random items left behind by hunters or explorers. They were the signs of a community, a colony even, established deep within the canyon. According to the report, the cavern walls and chambers contained carvings and figurines unmistakably linked to Egyptian culture. The most famous of these was the statue of Isis, but there were others too. Smaller statuettes, idols, and decorative objects that carried the marks of Egyptian religion and artistry. And finally, the mummies. The Gazette claimed that human remains were discovered placed in niches carved into the walls of the cavern. These weren't skeletons left in shallow graves. They were embalmed, wrapped, and preserved in the same manner used in Egypt thousands of years earlier. That detail alone was enough to electrify readers. Embalming was never a practice of the indigenous peoples of North America. If mummies truly rested in those chambers, it could only mean one thing. An old world culture had crossed the ocean and left its dead behind in Arizona. Adding to the intrigue, The mummies were described as being smaller than average. That single line has been reinterpreted endlessly over the decades. Some saw it as evidence of a forgotten race. Others imagined dwarves or even giants in contrast. But in every retelling, the mummies stand at the center. Pottery and tools could be dismissed as coincidence, but embalmed human remains, that was something unique, something foreign, something unmistakably Egyptian. The most powerful piece of the Gazette article wasn't the tunnels or even the mummies. It was a name. The story identified Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian Institution as the academic overseeing the find. That single detail elevated the discovery from sensational rumor to scientific authority. In 1909, the Smithsonian was the gatekeeper of archaeology and history in the United States. If they were involved, it meant this wasn't a prospector's tall tale. It was real. Readers at the time would have taken the mention of the Smithsonian as proof that the discovery had already been vetted, studied, and confirmed by the highest institution in the land. But over the decades, what began as a note of credibility transformed into the centerpiece of the mystery. Professor Jordan does not appear in any of the Smithsonian's records. No official report of such an expedition exists. To many, this silence is the strongest proof of all. If the Smithsonian had uncovered an Egyptian colony in Arizona, the implications would have been staggering. Entire historical timelines would have been challenged. Textbooks would need rewriting. And so, believers argue, the find was deliberately suppressed. The absence of records is framed not as weakness, but as strength. The Smithsonian's refusal to acknowledge Jordan or the expedition is cast as part of the cover-up. Believers say artifacts were seized, documentation destroyed, and the discovery erased from official history. To them, the Smithsonian didn't just stumble across a story too big to tell. They buried it. This connection is why the tale of Egypt in the Grand Canyon refuses to fade. Without the Smithsonian's name, it would be just another strange newspaper article. With it, it becomes a suppressed chapter of history, one hidden in plain sight. If the article had been a one-off curiosity, perhaps the story would have died there. But the canyon itself seems to support the legend. For decades, hikers and explorers have reported sealed caves, welded gates, and entire zones closed to the public. Some of these sealed areas are found near rock formations with names that sound suspiciously Egyptian: Isis Temple, Cheops Pyramid, Tower of Ra. To believers, the clustering of these names is no coincidence. They argue that 19th century explorers and surveyors named these landmarks after what they knew was hidden nearby, evidence of an Egyptian presence buried in the rock. Modern restrictions add even more fuel. Certain parts of the canyon are marked off limits, and attempts to enter them are met with fines or removal by rangers. The timing and placement of these restrictions feel too deliberate. Why are so many of the canyon's no-go zones near the very landmarks tied to Egypt by name? These accounts combined with the Egyptian place names form a trail of breadcrumbs. To believers, the sealed caves are not about safety. They are about secrecy. The canyon itself becomes evidence, not only in the names of its landmarks, but in the areas the public is not allowed to see. Every sealed entrance and every forbidden zone is read as proof that what the Gazette described is still there, hidden in plain sight, just beyond the reach of ordinary eyes. The Gazette article was only the spark. Over time, the story of Egypt in the Grand Canyon grew far beyond its original report, fueled by retellings, eyewitness accounts, and the layering of new details that made the mystery feel larger with each passing decade. One of the most persistent additions is the idea of multiple entrances. Believers claim the underground city wasn't accessed by a single hidden cave, but by a network of openings scattered across the canyon. Some entrances, they say, were concealed high up on the cliffs, while others lay closer to the river. This expansion transformed the story from a single cavern into the possibility of an entire underground complex, a labyrinth sprawling beneath the desert. Others speak of discoveries the Gazette never mentioned, advanced technology, strange machinery, or devices left behind by whoever built the site. Some claim explorers glimpsed tools made of unknown metals, or stonework so precise it suggested a level of engineering beyond what should have been possible at the time. These details, though unverified, fold neatly into the wider world of forbidden archaeology, where lost civilizations are said to have wielded knowledge we no longer understand. The story of the giants adds yet another layer. In some versions, the smaller-than-average mummies described by the Gazette were reimagined as something entirely different. Enormous skeletons, 8 or 10 feet tall, entombed in the canyon's depths. Such claims link the site to other legends across America, where giant bones are rumored to have been uncovered only to vanish into museum vaults. For believers, this connects the Grand Canyon not just to Egypt, but to a suppressed global history of beings erased from the human record. Native American traditions were woven in as well. The Hopi tell of the ant people, who led humanity underground during times of catastrophe, sheltering them in vast subterranean realms. To believers, this sounds like more than a myth. They argue it echoes precisely what the Gazette described. Chambers cut into the rock, a hidden world beneath the surface. Some go further, suggesting the ant people themselves were connected to the Egyptians or to a much older civilization that seeded cultures across the globe. Fringe historians point to missing Smithsonian crates, supposed letters, or secondhand testimonies as proof that the artifacts were real but hidden. None of these claims can be verified, but each one adds momentum to the story, ensuring it never fades into obscurity. The Gazette may have planted the seed, but these later additions, multiple entrances, strange technologies, giants, native traditions, and modern sightings, turned the mystery into something far larger. They transformed a single newspaper story into a legend of global proportions, one that touches on ancient civilizations, suppressed discoveries, and the enduring belief that humanity's history is far older and far stranger than we are taught. But as compelling as it sounds, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and when we turn to the counterpoints, the cracks in the story begin to show. The claims are bold, but boldness doesn't equal truth. For every statue of Isis or sealed cave whispered about online, there are practical explanations and glaring gaps. To see the Grand Canyon mystery clearly, we need to set the evidence against the cold light of scrutiny. The entire story rests on a single newspaper, and not even one of national repute. The Arizona Gazette was a small regional paper with no record of wide syndication or editorial oversight. It existed in the heyday of yellow journalism, when papers frequently printed exaggerated or fabricated stories to boost sales. Importantly, no other newspaper of the time picked up the claim. In an era when shocking stories traveled fast, that silence is telling. If an Egyptian complex had been found in Arizona, it would have made national headlines, yet the Gazette stood alone. For many historians, that silence is all the debunking they need. The descriptions of artifacts in the article are suspiciously vague. Terms like Oriental design or Egyptian resemblance are subjective, not the kind of language one expects in a professional archaeological report. The supposed mummies, said to be smaller than average, could easily have been an invention to make the story more exotic. And the mix of Egyptian and Asian influence raises a red flag. Why would one site in Arizona contain such a random blend of cultures? To skeptics, this looks less like genuine discovery and more like a journalist throwing in every exotic detail they could think of to spice up the story. No physical artifacts have ever surfaced. Not a single tool, statue, or preserved body has been presented in any collection, public or private. If this was real, where are they? Perhaps the biggest weakness in the story is the supposed Smithsonian involvement. There is no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan ever working for the institution or existing at all. The Smithsonian itself has repeatedly denied any knowledge of such an expedition. The idea that the Smithsonian suppressed the evidence only emerged later when people began asking why nothing was ever found. But invoking a cover-up without proof creates a circular argument. The evidence is missing because it was destroyed, and it was destroyed because it was evidence. That's not evidence, it's assumption. While the Smithsonian has been accused of suppressing other controversial finds over the years, none of those accusations have ever produced verifiable documentation. In the absence of proof, Professor Jordan looks less like a shadowy gatekeeper and more like a name invented to give the story credibility. The claims about forbidden areas also crumble under scrutiny. Yes, parts of the Grand Canyon are off-limits, but for good reasons. Many caves are unstable, prone to collapse, or contain fragile ecosystems that would be destroyed by human traffic. Others are sacred sites for indigenous tribes, protected by law and custom. As for the Egyptian names, Isis Temple, Tower of Ra, Cheops Pyramid, they were given by 19th century explorers who enjoyed classical mythology and simply labeled rock formations after gods and legends. There is no evidence those names reflect anything other than a fascination with the ancient world. What some see as secrecy, others see as standard preservation. Welded cave entrances aren't hiding Egyptian tombs. They're keeping hikers from wandering into unsafe spaces. The later additions, giants, advanced technology, lost civilizations, are the weakest of all. None of these details appear in the original Gazette article. They only surface decades later in books and forums devoted to forbidden archaeology. They're the product of legend building, where a story becomes more elaborate the further it drifts from its source. Eyewitness accounts are unreliable. A hiker glimpsing a dark cave opening from a distance may see what they want to see, not what's really there. And Native American legends, like the Hopi stories of the Ant People, carry symbolic meaning within their own culture. To equate them directly with Egyptians or underground cities is to strip them of context and force them into a framework they were never meant to fit. In the end, the biggest counterpoint is the simplest. After more than a century, there is still no physical evidence, no artifacts, no skeletons, no photographs, nothing. Just a single article in a small paper, expanded into legend over time. The Grand Canyon mystery is compelling because it's built on absence. The more evidence that fails to appear, the more some believe it must have been hidden. But the lack of proof cuts both ways. Either it was destroyed in a cover-up, or it was never there in the first place. And that tension between possibility and fabrication is what keeps the story alive. If the counterpoints reduce the story to a hoax, the alternative theories give it life again. They invite us to imagine possibilities that slip through the cracks of conventional history. Some are plausible, some are bold, and some verge on the mythic. But all of them keep the mystery of Egypt in the Grand Canyon alive. Transatlantic travelers. Of all the theories tied to Egypt in the Grand Canyon, the most grounded is also the simplest, that the Egyptians, or their seafaring contemporaries, the Phoenicians, were capable of crossing the Atlantic. If they could reach America, then the existence of a settlement, no matter how small, in Arizona becomes at least possible. We know the Egyptians were not strangers to water. They built reed boats that sailed the Nile and great ships that carried them across the Red Sea into trade with Arabia and East Africa. One of the most famous finds from Egypt's Old Kingdom is the Khufu ship, a 4,500-year-old wooden vessel buried near the Great Pyramid. Its size and craftsmanship show that the Egyptians had the skill to build ships that could endure long voyages. The Phoenicians, their maritime neighbors, pushed even further. Greek and Roman historians recorded Phoenician voyages that reached Britain, explored the west coast of Africa, and may have even circumnavigated the continent as early as 600 BCE. If Phoenician sailors could hug the African coast and survive the Atlantic swells, then catching the Canary Current could, in theory, carry them all the way to the Americas. In modern times, explorers have tested this idea. In 1970, Thor Heyerdahl sailed the Ra II, a papyrus reed boat built in the style of ancient Egypt from Morocco across the Atlantic. He and his crew successfully reached Barbados, proving that such a voyage was not only possible, it could be done using technology available thousands of years ago. Supporters of the transatlantic theory also point to controversial scientific claims. In the 1990s, researchers reported finding traces of cocaine and nicotine in Egyptian mummies. Both substances are native to the Americas, leading to speculation that ancient Egyptians had contact with the New World. Mainstream scholars dispute these findings, suggesting contamination or flawed testing. Still, the idea lingers. If the Egyptians had access to American plants, could it be because of direct contact? Architecture and culture add more fuel. Pyramids rise in both Egypt and Mesoamerica. Both civilizations worshipped the sun. Both aligned monuments to the stars. To skeptics, these are coincidences, examples of human cultures solving similar problems in similar ways. But to believers, they are fingerprints, signs of cultural contact that spread across oceans. In this theory, the Grand Canyon site described in the 1909 article wasn't Atlantis, Lemuria, or a lost civilization at all. It was a colony, an outpost established by Egyptian or Phoenician voyagers who crossed the ocean, navigated up rivers, and carved out a sanctuary in the canyon. Shared ancient origins. Not everyone believes Egyptians physically reached the Americas. Another interpretation is that the similarities between Egypt and the supposed Grand Canyon site point to something much older, a shared origin civilization that influenced cultures around the globe. Across the world, there are uncanny parallels in ancient architecture and myth. Pyramids are the most famous example. Egypt built them in Giza. The Maya and Aztecs built them in Mesoamerica. Step pyramids exist in China, Sudan, and even the Canary Islands. Each culture used them differently, tombs, temples, or observatories, but the form itself is strikingly consistent. Was this coincidence or inheritance? Flood myths strengthen the case. Nearly every ancient civilization tells of a great deluge that wiped out humanity. The Sumerians had Utnapishtim, the Bible has Noah, and the Greeks had Deucalion. Among Native Americans, Hopi traditions describe the world being destroyed and remade in cycles, with humanity saved by beings who guided them into underground shelters. To believers, These stories aren't allegory, they're memories. Fragments of a catastrophe that shattered a global civilization thousands of years ago. Authors like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson argue that the Younger Dryas impact event, a sudden climate shift around 12,800 years ago, may have been the real disaster behind the myths. If an advanced culture existed before that time, its survivors may have scattered, bringing their knowledge with them. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas could all be branches of the same tree. In this framework, the Grand Canyon site described in the Gazette wasn't Egyptian at all. It was older. The Egyptians, like the Maya, inherited their practices from a forgotten ancestor culture, and the canyon's chambers were a surviving outpost of that lost world. The Egyptian features weren't imports from across the Atlantic, but reflections of a deeper lineage that both Egypt and the Americas once shared. This theory also explains why the Gazette article mentioned Oriental artifacts alongside Egyptian ones. If the canyon site was truly a remnant of a global culture, it would contain influences from multiple regions, not just one. Egyptian, Hindu, Buddhist, and native motifs could coexist in a single place because they all came from the same source. Skeptics dismiss this as fantasy, but for many, it solves a puzzle. The similarities across continents don't have to mean direct contact. They can mean common inheritance. And if that's the case, then the Grand Canyon may hold not just a local mystery, but a relic of humanity's forgotten past. Misidentification of native sites. Not every explanation requires Egypt to cross the Atlantic or a lost civilization to resurface. A more grounded theory is that the 1909 article may have been rooted in something real, but misunderstood or misrepresented. The Grand Canyon is not empty. For thousands of years, it has been home to indigenous peoples who left behind a deep archaeological record. The ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings tucked into the canyon's sheer walls. The Havasupai, Hopi, and Zuni all hold traditions tied to the land, and their ancestors left ceremonial caves, granaries, and burial chambers scattered across the region. To an early explorer unfamiliar with native traditions, these sites may have seemed foreign, even exotic. A ceremonial chamber filled with human remains might have been described as a tomb. Petroglyphs or pictographs carved into the walls could be misread as hieroglyphs. A figure carved in a stylized way might be mistaken for Isis or another Egyptian deity. Even the tools and pottery, familiar to archaeologists today, could be portrayed as Oriental artifacts by a journalist eager to impress readers. It's important to remember the time period. In 1909, America's understanding of native history was shallow at best. Indigenous cultures were often dismissed as primitive, incapable of producing monumental architecture or advanced art. Against that bias, an underground complex of chambers in the canyon might not have been recognized for what it was. Instead, it was exoticized, rebranded as Egyptian, because Egypt carried prestige and mystery that native cultures were denied. This misidentification theory doesn't rule out that Kincaid, or whoever inspired the article, may have actually seen something unusual. Perhaps he stumbled upon a genuine burial chamber or ceremonial cave. But when filtered through the lens of sensationalist journalism, the story transformed into something larger, stranger, and more marketable. Egypt was a hot topic. Native archaeology was not. And so the Gazette may have taken a real discovery and dressed it up in Egyptian garb, leaving the truth buried under layers of exaggeration. If true, then the tragedy is that the story obscured rather than revealed history. Instead of honoring the canyon's indigenous heritage, the article turned it into a tale of outsiders. The Egyptian twist made it exotic, but in doing so, it erased the reality of the people who actually lived there. These theories, from Egyptian voyagers to suppressed civilizations, all circled the same void, the unanswered question of what lies hidden in the canyon. Maybe it was all a newspaper hoax. Maybe it was a native site misidentified. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a glimpse into a chapter of history we were never meant to see. Until evidence is found or admitted, the story remains suspended between possibility and myth, inviting us to wonder what else the world might be hiding. The story of Egypt and the Grand Canyon is one of those rare mysteries where a single newspaper article has kept people debating for over a century. On one hand, it has all the hallmarks of a sensational hoax: vague details, no corroborating evidence, and silence from every institution that should have followed up. On the other, it has just enough specificity that it refuses to die. That tension is what makes it powerful. If it's false, then it's simply one of the most successful pieces of yellow journalism ever printed. But if even a fragment of it is true, then it changes everything. It means Egyptians, or someone else entirely, reached the Americas long before Columbus. It means the Grand Canyon might hold secrets about humanity's past that were hidden, misinterpreted, or deliberately erased. Ultimately, this mystery says more about us than it does about the canyon. We want history to be larger than life, to have hidden chapters that rewrite the story we were taught. We want to believe there's more beneath the surface, that caves can hold forgotten worlds, and that the truth is never as simple as it seems. So maybe the real question isn't whether the Egyptians were here, but why we're so drawn to the idea in the first place. Do we sense something missing in the story of our past? Or do we simply crave mysteries that can never quite be solved? One thing is certain: until hard evidence emerges, the truth of Egypt in the Grand Canyon will remain just out of reach, perched between history and legend, fact and fiction. And before we go, I'll leave you a question. Do you think the Grand Canyon once held an Egyptian colony hidden beneath the rock? Or is it nothing more than a newspaper story that spiraled into legend? Let me know what you believe down in the comments. And if there are other topics and mysteries you'd like me to explore in the future, I'd love to hear your suggestions. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unknown, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and it means I can keep bringing you stories that challenge the way we see history and reality.